All right, welcome back. Federalist number 78. Okay, so the context that we're looking at this required document from is the design of the judicial branch protects the Supreme Court's independence as a branch of government, and the emergence and use of judicial review remains a powerful judicial practice. So, independence and judicial review both will be discussed in Federalist number 78. All right, so we start off right at the beginning, and he gets right to his point. This is Alexander Hamilton writing, Federalist number 78, and he says about judges are to hold their offices during good behavior. This means that they hold that job for life. So unlike the president who serves a 4-year term, House and Senate who serve 2- and 6-year terms respectively, if you are a federal judge, you hold that office as long as you want, provided that you don't break the law, in which case you could be impeached and removed. He goes on to say that this is the best expedient to an impartial administration of the laws. So that's really a lot of what we're going to discuss through the rest of this video, is him elaborating on his claim here that having life terms for judges is the best way to make sure we have an impartial or independent judiciary. All right, so somebody might object to the fact that you're giving these people this job for life and be like, well, hey, isn't the whole point of this Constitution to make sure that no one person or group gets too much power? If they have a life term, they're not subject to the people. They can do whatever they want. We have no recourse. That sounds really dangerous. And here Hamilton argues that the judiciary is the least dangerous branch. He says the judiciary, from the nature of its functions, will always be the least dangerous to the political rights of the Constitution. The reason? Because it will be least in a capacity to annoy or injure them. In other words, there is nothing the judiciary can actually do to harm people's rights, is what he's claiming, or at least that it will be much more difficult for them to do so. Again, he's going to elaborate on that further. So, continuing with that same thought, he says of why the judiciary is so weak. The judiciary, on the contrary, so in preceding section of this, he talked about powers that Congress and the president both have. The judiciary, on the contrary, has no influence over either the sword or the purse. So, the sword meaning war powers. We would say that the president has the power of the sword. He is commander-in-chief. He can fight war. He can lead an army. Congress has the power of the purse. They have budget power. They control money and spending in government. Judicial branch has neither of those powers. They have nothing that they can directly do. So if you go on to the next sentence I have highlighted, it may truly be said to have neither force nor will. So it doesn't have the power of an army. It doesn't have the will of the people through elections like Congress does. So they don't have any real power. They have neither force nor will, but merely judgment. So all they can do is judge cases. And then here's the kicker. Even that judgment power isn't that strong because it says, and must ultimately depend on the aid of the executive, even for the efficacy of its judgments. What he's meaning here is that the judicial branch can't actually enforce their own decisions. So they make a ruling, but they rely on the executive to actually implement and enforce that ruling. So again, remember why he's saying all this. People were concerned that giving life terms to judges could be empowering them too much and it could harm people's freedom. And he is here arguing that that is not the case, that they lack the power to take away people's rights, to do anything bad. And in fact, the only power they do have to judge is limited because they can't even enforce their own judgments. Again, he goes on to continue with this same line of attack where he says the judiciary is beyond comparison the weakest of the three. It can never attack with success either of the other two. So again, you have my annotated version. The judiciary is the weakest branch and cannot harm the legislative or executive branches. All right, so by this point, Hamilton has made his argument of why we don't need to worry about a judicial branch having a life term. Now he turns his attention to the independence and why it's so important that they be independent. So that'll be the next couple of slides. So he says that liberty has nothing to fear from the judicial branch alone, but would have everything to fear from its union with either of the other departments. We'll call them branches. In other words, The judicial branch, as he has argued, it can't take away your liberty. It has nothing to fear from the judicial branch. But if the judicial branch is not independent and acts in union with the executive branch or in union with the legislative branch, it will all of a sudden allow liberty to be taken away. And he says that the natural weakness of the judiciary is in continual jeopardy of being overpowered or influenced by the other branches. And nothing can contribute so much to its firmness and independence as permanency in office. So, I'll spell out an example for you. Let's say Congress passes a law that bans religion in the United States. That would be blatantly unconstitutional. It would clearly violate the First Amendment. He is worried about if the Supreme Court, the judicial branch, is not sufficiently independent, if they are reliant on Congress for something, then they might go ahead and allow Congress to do something that is completely unconstitutional and destructive to liberty. But if they are independent, and he says the best way to contribute to independence is permanency in office, meaning a life term, so they can't be fired, can't be removed because of a decision they make, now they aren't worried about pleasing the legislative branch. They can be worried about actually protecting liberty and honoring the Constitution. Again, these are very similar arguments, one leading into the next here. So now, again, with the idea of independent courts, he is saying that this is particularly essential in a limited constitution. So he's really talking about a limited government, a government limited by a constitution like ours is. And he gives you examples of things that Congress can't do: shall pass no bills of attainder, no ex post facto laws, must guarantee the writ of habeas corpus, all those things there. And he's saying essentially that it must be the duty of the courts, this is what I've highlighted, whose duty it must be to declare all acts contrary to the manifest tenor of the Constitution void. So if Congress does something that the Constitution does not allow them to do, the Supreme Court must rule it unconstitutional. They must void it. Otherwise, the Constitution is meaningless. Read his last sentence there. He says, without this, all the reservations of particular rights or privileges would amount to nothing. In other words, it doesn't matter what the First Amendment says or the Second Amendment. It would be meaningless if Congress violates them and then the court does nothing. So the court needs to be independent of Congress and the president so they can actually rule things unconstitutional to protect the Constitution. And that's, again, he's here just going on to the idea of judicial review. So he is defending judicial review as a concept here. It wasn't written directly in the Constitution, so here he makes the argument for it. He says the Constitution is a fundamental law, meaning it's the foundation of all other laws. So it belongs to the courts to decide the meaning of the Constitution. And if there happens to be an irreconcilable variance between the two, meaning a law passed by Congress and the Constitution, the last thing I've highlighted there is the Constitution ought to be preferred to the statute or law. So if Congress passes a law banning freedom of religion, that goes against the First Amendment. The First Amendment, as part of the Constitution, is greater than, more fundamental than the law. So it is the job of the court to prefer the Constitution and void the law that's in conflict. So again, he says here that the courts are to be considered as bulwarks of a limited constitution against legislative encroachments, meaning that sometimes Congress will try to encroach on and to take away, to violate the Constitution. So it's the court's job to protect the Constitution from the legislative branch. So they are the defenders of the Constitution, and he says permanent life tenure of judicial offices, that this will contribute to them being independent, which is essential to their performance. He says this independence of the judges is equally requisite to guard the Constitution. So we want to view them, the Supreme Court, as Hamilton does here, as guardians of the Constitution. And who are they protecting the Constitution from? From the people, from Congress, and from the president. All right, if you haven't already, don't forget subscribe to my channel. Please hit that like button if this video helped you at all, helped clear up Federalist 78. Until next time, this has been a La Money production.